One of the largest U.S. transportation companies just put out a pretty gloomy outlook, adding to the concerns that there's an economic slowdown occurring. We're going to cover that news story along with one of the sectors in the high-flying Nasdaq that seems to be going in the opposite direction.
We saw a mixed bag out of the U.S. markets last week, as the Dow Jones and the Nasdaq were both positive, and the S&P 500 was down slightly, but the Russell 2000 was down about 1.2%. Now, while the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, and the Nasdaq are close to or above their all-time highs, the Russell 2000 is still 10% away from its all-time highs. Now, this is also concerning because the Russell 2000 over the past 2 months is down about 1.5%, while the S&P 500 is up close to 4%. This is concerning to us because the Russell 2000 is one of the leading indexes that we watch as a gauge of the U.S. indexes. Now, foreign and emerging markets were both positive last week, with both being up over 1%, and foreign markets are now up about 13.5%, while emerging markets are up over 14%. But with that being said, the international stocks and the international markets as a whole are still down about 19% from their all-time highs. So today we're looking at a chart of biotechs, and biotech is a sector of the Nasdaq. Now, last week we looked at the semiconductor index, which was one of the leading sectors inside the Nasdaq. So today we're looking at biotechs, which again is a sector of the Nasdaq that seems to be lagging. So there are a couple different things I want to look at on this chart. First is the blue line that's going through the middle of the chart, and that's the 200-day moving average. Now, if you look to the far right of this chart, you can tell that this biotech index is below the 200-day moving average, which is a bearish signal. Now, also you'll see the thicker blue lines at the top and the bottom of the chart, and this is the range that biotechs has been trading in for all of 2019 so far. Now, a few weeks ago, biotechs broke down below the bottom line, which was a support level, after trading through that range so far for the whole year, which again is another bearish signal. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Russell 2000 when I was going over the returns, about the Russell 2000 being a lagger, and now we see this biotech sector also lagging, which could show that there's more of a risk-off mentality coming into the U.S. markets.
One of the largest U.S. trucking companies, J.B. Hunt, reported their first quarter earnings last week. And it wasn't the earnings that made the headlines. It was what they said on their conference call after. Now, if you're not familiar with earnings, companies report their last quarter's earnings and then have a conference call to discuss their future outlook for the next quarter and year ahead. On their conference call, they were first asked why they thought there was a slowdown in activity in the first quarter. And they said that January and February, they felt that it was due to weather. But in March, demand didn't pick back up, which was something that was surprising to them. And they also noted that in April, they still didn't see a demand accelerate. Their CEO was also quoted during the call as saying, "The warehouses are full and inventory levels are creeping up." Now, this is important because trucking is a huge tell as to how the economy is doing, because they are shipping goods and services that are being bought. So inventory levels starting to creep up isn't a good thing. But it's also important to note at the end of the call, they also said that aggressive pricing in the trucking industry is starting to be a concern for them, and they may have to look at cutting drivers' wages. So the real question becomes, is this an economic slowdown indicator, or is this just an industry that's starting to be disrupted by the likes of companies like Uber Freight? The other big news story from last week was out of China, as the first quarter GDP was reported and it beat expectations, up 6.4%. Now, many analysts cited that optimism between the US and China trade negotiations and also the Chinese stimulus program that's being instituted are the two main factors that are causing this. This week is going to be a huge week for earnings, as we have 33% of the S&P 500 companies reporting their first quarter's earnings.
It's also an important week for U.S. economic data, and the most important of those is going to be the first quarter GDP numbers. Thanks a lot for watching today as we strive to give you everything you need to know about the markets in 5 minutes or less.
If you're watching on Facebook, please like and share our video, and if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel.